Welcome to the pilot episode of Autism Fridays with Christopher Cleveland.
Thank you for tuning in to Autism Fridays with Christopher Cleveland. I am your host, Christopher Cleveland. As of March 16, 2020, the Governor of Utah has issued a statewide order asking public, private, and charter schools to close off their physical locations and provide online substitutions in order to ensure the safety of the students and parents and teachers, as well as paraprofessionals and other staff within our school districts across the state. The original orders were meant to end March 29th, but fears of a COVID-19 spread basically warranted that we extend that order all the way to May 1st. In fact, here in Grand County alone, those fears became somewhat of a reality on March 27, 2020, when we had our first confirmed positive COVID-19 case, with 4 more in our neighboring San Juan County, to name a few. Now, for those of you watching at home that maybe don't know what autism spectrum disorder is, let's briefly define it. It's an umbrella term for a group of disorders characterized by difficulties in attaining or even acknowledging the importance of certain social skills. The best example of that being communication. Or else, if their communicative faculties are intact, having trouble understanding context and sticking too hard to one train of thought, even when it isn't the subject of discussion in any circles of friends that they might have. I was really susceptible to this growing up, and I can think of about 2, maybe 3 obsessions I had the most throughout my childhood that created many an awkward moment like this. And I'll delve into a little bit of detail about that. Before I was 10, my predominant obsession was dinosaurs. Now, this wasn't your standard watching every documentary and watching every Jurassic Park as it came out or any of that stuff. That already annoys a lot of parents as it is. No, this was not only learning the appearance, or most likely appearance, of a specimen of dinosaur, but also learning its common and scientific name, as well as what era it lived in during the what period rather, during the Mesozoic, as well as common time frames. For example, the iguanodon living in the early to mid-Cretaceous, a period of about 23 million years, or whatever scientists are saying was the case. That means that I could tell you what a dinosaur was just by looking at it. I could tell you what period it lived in during the Mesozoic era. I could tell you for how long that period was, or periods if it was a dinosaur that lived more than one, and I could tell you what types of plants it ate if it was an herbivore, or what types of dinosaurs it ate if it was a carnivore. After I was 10, I started to kind of deviate away from dinosaurs, and the first obsession that led me away, rather, was Star Wars. Now, similar thing here. Bear in mind, this was back before Disney bought Lucasfilm, and therefore bought Star Wars, Indiana Jones, and Willow, to name a few. Therefore, back then, as the Star Wars guru, so to speak, of my school, I could tell you, for instance, about a Jedi who took the fight to Darth Vader between Star Wars Episode 3 and Star Wars Episode 4, won, but had to escape because a legion of stormtroopers was coming down on him. I could tell you said Jedi's favorite lightsaber forms, most heavily relied upon force powers, and I can even tell you, should they have had one, of what their pre-Order 66 life was like, and whether or not they were a general during the Clone Wars, or they were a Padawan learner to a general from the Clone Wars. And this obsession actually reached a new height by the time I was about halfway through high school, where I began writing Star Wars fan fictions that I would then publish to fan fiction sites. I predominantly wrote fan fictions about the character Darth Maul. I still don't understand why, but that was the case. However, there was one obsession that was concurrent to this, just a little bit more in the background. And this was ancient histories and mythologies. This tended to come out in particular during my social studies classes when I was in high school, and blossomed into an understanding of Egyptian, Roman, Greek, and even some Japanese mythology, with some reading of the Mayan and Aztec creation story, the Papava. Excuse me. And the thing about these obsessions is that when Disney bought Star Wars and put out their first products, I increasingly became disenchanted with Star Wars as a whole and started turning towards more of this ancient history, ancient mythology obsession, keeping in mind that it was already enough, even in high school, for me to have read Shakespeare for fun. What kid does that? I also read Dante's Inferno a year before it was required. I read Virgil's Aeneid, which was never required of even my AP English class at the same year. Again, I just read it for fun. I swear I don't know why. But my proudest achievement as far as anything historical was reading James Clavell's Shogun when I was a junior as well, keeping in mind that was my first 1,000 page plus book. And that one I think had about 1,054 in the copy that I read, maybe. But one of its sequels had over 1,200, but that was when I was a senior. Point is, I was super obsessed about ancient history, ancient mythology. Star Wars was the forerunner when I was in high school, but ancient histories, languages, mythologies consumed my being, especially after Disney came and, in my opinion, ruined Star Wars. However, this trend of obsession that I'm talking about is only the result of the fact that I possessed something that a lot of autistic kids can't necessarily claim: an understanding of metaphors and idioms and non-logical concepts of that nature. Bear in mind, sometimes I still have trouble understanding metaphor and idiom from anything other than maybe a dictionary standpoint. But there are autistic kids out there, best represented by Drax the Destroyer from Guardians of the Galaxy, that only understand the logical side of things, that only understand the analytical stuff, that only understand things that are basically the equivalent of 1 plus 1 equals 2. In other words, highly logical. Therefore, the nature of obsession in autistic kids tends to be a lot more math, economics, geometry, physics, geography, things of that nature that most especially require a lot of numbers. And we'll get to what that means in a sec. Thank you for tuning back into Autism Fridays with Christopher Cleveland. I'm your host, Christopher Cleveland. So last time we defined autism spectrum disorder, we got a little bit up to date as to the status of the quarantine, and we also talked a bit about obsession, and I told you some rather self-embarrassing facts about obsession itself, from my life at least. Now I'd like to discuss the root of this obsession. There's a characteristic typically observed in severely autistic people, though it isn't exclusively them, where they might be so cognitively impaired that they may be incapable of independent living, but teach them the fundamentals of one particular subject, and then they can take that to a height where you ask them a question about that subject, no matter how hard you think the question is, and they can usually nail it. A great example of this, and kind of as an example that kind of lends to the stereotype of autistic people being not independent but math whizzes, is Rain Man, where Dustin Hoffman plays the autistic savant and Tom Cruise plays his younger non-autistic brother. There's a scene in there I like when Tom Cruise is taking Dustin Hoffman for some examinations, and the doctor notices this trend of accurate mathematical information coming out of Dustin Hoffman's mouth. So he plugs in a few equations in the calculator and notices that Dustin Hoffman, from memory, is consistent with the answers that are given on the calculator. Now, when I was a teenager, and as I grew up, I observed a similar trend amongst higher functioning autistic people, as well as myself. Now, obviously, a lot of high functioning people are not as impaired as Dustin Hoffman's character, but there is still that one area, that one talent, where ask a question about it or ask them to do something related to it, and they can seem ingenious. And with the blessing of my high school special ed teacher, I decided to dub this the savant style talents of the high functioning autistic group. I bring this all up because there's something about this talent that parents of kids on the autism spectrum, and especially the high functioning end, should know. If their child presents themselves with having that talent, it's not uncommon, although not, a standard, for said kids to become so obsessed with this talent as to disappear for hours or even days at a time if allowed. For example, when I was starting out as an author and I bought myself a leather-bound unlined paper journal, I actually took that and translated ideas I had in English into Sanskrit writings that I then wrote down into the journal itself to give it the appearance of a sorcerer book. And I was at that for hours at a time, for days. And I bring that up because parents of high-functioning autistic children who have a savant-style talent have observed what I call a cognitive dissonance. Now, the bad side of this, in extreme cases, is foregoing food, water, and hygienic needs, that sort of thing. Think about Charles Darwin or Nikola Tesla, how they could disappear into their work for days. And you kind of have an example of what I'm talking about. On the other hand, though, there is a way to use this cognitive dissonance to one's advantage. And that's what we're going to talk about. So, with this cognitive dissonance, a lot of high-functioning autistic people that I've encountered, and myself included, usually understand the concept of a social contract or a binding contract. And the reason I bring this up is because this is for parents of those who have a high-functioning autistic kid. One way in which you can help your child keep busy and not notice the quarantine time so much is to make a contract whereby if they have a savant-style talent, they're allowed to disappear into it for however long they like, as long as, 1, they come out for food when you say that dinner's ready or that lunch is ready, etc. 2, they're caught up on their schoolwork. That means they're not missing any assignments in any classes, not even the classes that they really don't like and don't feel like getting to. Trust me, this goes a long way to ensuring that your kids' grades are alright. But there's also a way that you can not only help them not notice the quarantine as much, if they're noticing it, however, there's a way to make them feel like a part of the family and work on their social skills as well using this. So, once the social contract is set, and by the way, maybe include some terms where maybe, they have to respect their siblings and their siblings have to respect their space whenever school isn't an issue, that kind of thing. Have the kid not only disappear into the project whenever they have free time, as long as they're caught up, but also maybe consider having them form a project that they then present to the family. I'll give you an example of this. So let's say you've got a kid who has a talent for anything political. Maybe have them draft up a bill that they then present before a Congress or a council represented by your family. If their talent is more mathematically inclined, maybe have them teach a new line of equations they came up with. Bearing in mind all deadlines are going to be, for now, April 31st, since the quarantine orders go until May 1st. If the child in question has talents more like mine with language, literature, and that sort of thing, maybe have them draft up what they think is the perfect story and tell them that. What it does, and have them tell that story, excuse me. What it does when you do that is it takes some of the burden off you for planning the family activities, first and foremost. And second, it allows your child to work on skills like persuasion, presentation, public speaking, skills that they're going to need later in life for job interviews, for writing up a will, basically anything you can think of, that would require an ability to persuade, or at the very least, to have some courage with public speaking. And at the same time, you also make them feel like they're contributing something to the family, which in these rather unusual times will become important for autistic kids. So basically, to summarize everything, find a savant style talent that your child has, make a social contract where in return for having free time to work on this as much as possible, they are to A, keep up with their schoolwork, B, respect their need for food, water, and hygiene, and C, present a final project by no later than the end of the month. Now, for those of you parents who have little kids that maybe are displaying some signs of a savant-style talent, let's go with the arts and crafts example for a moment. Let's say you're a mom of a child who's 4 or 5 years old that's autistic, but they display an uncanny ability for arts and crafts. Teach them a project. Teach them maybe how to make a paper dog, for example. And if they make any progress at all, celebrate that with your friends, your family, with anyone who maybe doesn't have a child that's on the autism spectrum, and actually especially with other people that you know who do have children on the autism spectrum. The point is, you want to help the social skills of your child grow during this time of crisis. Speaking as someone who created an after-school social development project in pre-quarantine times, by the way, you want to help them heighten their social skills, you want to help them feel valid, and you want to take some of the edge off you for planning the family activities. With all this said, we're going to go ahead and go to the questions from home after this break. Thank you. Christopher Cleveland. Once again, I am your host, Christopher Cleveland. Last time we introduced the idea of the autistic savant, we defined what autism spectrum disorder is, and we even brought you up to date, relatively speaking, about some of the current happenings in relation to COVID-19 quarantine. As a result, we also came up with ideas for how to use a quote-unquote savant-style talent in a high-functioning autistic person to not just provide family entertainment, but also heighten their social skills and help them have a sense of validation upon achieving the completion of a project related to their talent. Now, I'd like to get into my favorite segment, perhaps, called Questions from Home. Our first question comes from Stephanie, who was born in Moab but currently lives in Arizona, which reads, "Dear Christopher, what can we do to celebrate Autism Awareness Month considering we're all in quarantine?" Now, this is a very good question, Stephanie, and it really comes down to the age of the child you have, or if you have more than one, children. So, as before, we suggested with little ones, maybe seeing if there's an arts and crafts project that they can do and feel validated for achieving any kind of progress on. In your child's case, from what you told me outside of the document, it seems to me like maybe establishing 2 or 3 non-verbal methods of communication with your child for extreme temper tantrums and all that kind of stuff would be your best advantage. I'll give you an example of one. So if you've ever seen those pads online, sheets of paper, by the way, that special ed teachers have used where a kid can point to items they want, I co-created a rather fascinating idea, I think, with the K-3 elementary SPED teacher. And what we did was we took one of those pads as a sheet of paper. We folded between the lines of visual stimuli, keeping in mind we had a 90% visually astute populace of autistic children, so we didn't want to overwhelm them with stimuli when we asked them what it is they wanted because they were nonverbal. So we folded at the lines in between the lines of stimuli. We then made it so that way you could rotate it, rotate it. So the first line would be I need, rotate. If you don't see what you want, rotate again, and then point out what you want when you see the relevant line. This way they have to actually think about what it is they're asking you, and hopefully maybe simmer down if they're already in a temper tantrum, such as might be the case with a child that's 6 years of age or younger. Now, with a teenager, that's a different story. So in addition to discovering a savant-style talent and using it to make them feel relevant and valid, as well as heightening their social skills, there are some other ideas. If they're the type of person that likes physical exercise, maybe encourage them to do chores around the house, whether it's inside the house, such as washing dishes and taking out the trash, or outside, such as chopping wood for the fireplace, if you do that. Point is, if they like movement, keep them moving however you can, especially if you don't have a savant-style talent that you can use to your advantage for that project. Unless maybe that is the savant-style talent, in which case that cognitive dissonance that was mentioned last time, where we can focus on something for a long period of time, will come to your advantage in making sure the house is well trimmed, maintained, etc. Now, our second question, by the way, good one, Stephanie. Our second question, also from Stephanie, is this. How can you explain stimming to someone that maybe isn't familiar with autism? Now, before I answer that question, I should explain what stimming is. So, stimming is an activity, unique to the autism spectrum usually, that is characterized by a series of unusual movements. This can involve jumping up and down, jumping in a circle, flailing the arms like this, or all three. Sometimes other stuff too. Pacing is sometimes included in this, especially pacing around the house. Now, with all this said, I think the best approach when you have someone that maybe isn't familiar with the autism spectrum is to maybe first make sure the person is familiar with meditation and what that is, and then explain that a lot of times for autistic people, stimming can be like another form of meditation. It can be stress relief, just as meditation might be. It can be clarity. It can be heightening focus. It can be a number of things that benefit the autistic person, and some autistic people do grow out of the need to do it, especially as alternative activities become available. Other examples that you can use, for the meditation or stimming standpoint is the bike rider who goes on a 2-mile ride to clear his head, or the yoga instructor who meditates for half an hour before she begins a class. Things of that nature. The difference is that the activities in stimming are a little less conventional than those examples that I gave. So terrific question, Stephanie. I'm really glad you asked it. Our third and final question comes from Mary, who lives in Moab, and it reads as follows. Dear Chris, can you hear better than most people, or is it just my sister? Now, Mary also explained when she was asking this question that her sister could hear sounds from her TV even if the sister in question had been away from the living room in her own bedroom with the TV on and could get upset by certain sounds. Now, in the interest of an effective answer to your question, I'll tackle the second part of that first. Is it just her? Short answer, no it's not. Long answer, It's a result of something that happens with some autistic people called a sensory motor impairment. Usually it's a sound that causes this, but it can be touch, taste, smell, and seeing something. I had a kindergartner that could hear the buzzing of fluorescent lights in the school buildings, especially if the lights weren't exactly brand spanking new, to kind of give you an example. In my case, however, it was more sensations. I'll give you an example of that. So, I love everything that's tomato or onion flavored, but good luck getting me to eat a whole slice of tomato or onion, or a whole tomato or a whole onion itself. Because the texture of the vegetable item or fruit or whatever uh, didn't feel that particularly great in my mouth, even if I liked the taste. So my stepmother to this day still has to cut up the tomato pretty small, though not as small as when I was a kid, whenever she's making spaghetti for myself, her, and my dad. Uh, but there was a hearing sensory motor impairment that I discovered I had in college. And what it was more of a circumstantial thing. So let's say this Airstream was designed with a little more old school, bricks and all that kind of stuff. And the sound waves were designed to bounce off the walls. That was more the setting that I was in when I discovered this. So I was in my 4th year of Dixie State University, and I had a U.S. history class at 9, my second to last that I had for my requirements in my bachelor degree, and I was in one such room as this. Bear in mind, I was still semi-sleepy, as maybe I had been up for at most an hour or something of that nature. And this guy came in to teach, who had this really loud southern accent that just bounced off the walls as he spoke, and sounded like multiple versions of him were speaking at the same time at times. And had I not needed the information that he was providing, or else had committed the information to memory, I probably would have bailed out of there and just taken the tests and just done the assignments, that sort of thing, because I could have forgiven all of that if he also wasn't an uninteresting speaker. He was the kind of guy who very clearly was there for the check, but had otherwise checked out, at least where U.S. history was concerned, and I later learned that wasn't even really his specialty. It was more African history that was more his specialty, as it related to U.S. history. So I had that going for me. But with more severely impaired autistic people, it's possible that a unit of campus security might have been needed to ensure the safety of the student and the professor, because if that same voice had bounced off with a severe student, it's quite possible that it would have caused them pain, and, as might have been the case with your sister, to maybe lash out and require, shall we say, more physical means of stopping them from harming themselves or whatever they perceive as the source of their pain. So it's not just your sister. It's a common phenomena in autism, though not universal, I should point out, called a sensory motor impairment. And my sensory motor impairment is usually certain sensations in my mouth, but was also certain sounds as well at one point. I hope that answers your question. That was an attempt to answer the first part, by the way. And just to kind of recap, I can sometimes hear better than certain people under certain circumstances. I'm a little more alert in certain contexts than the average person. So anyway, I hope that answers your question, Mary. And with that, we will come to the conclusion of our show with this statement. In concluding the show, I wanted to say, first off, thank you guys so much for the overwhelming support that you have given this project ever since I revealed that I had conceived it. So, a little bit of background. Before I committed myself to this, I was a temporary housekeeper at the hospital. The majority of my shifts consisted of me doing laundry, so technically I wasn't exactly near anything that had been in our COVID-19 testing tent or anything of that nature just yet. Although, if I had stayed past the March 27th or March 28th testing positive, I probably would have had to handle that stuff. So I thought about it while I was at the laundry, and I was thinking to myself, you know what? I want to do something for Autism Awareness Month, but I also want to recognize that we're basically under quarantine to curb the spread of the COVID-19 virus. What can I do? It was then that I was watching shows like Stephen Colbert, John Oliver, Steve Wilkos, etc., and I realized, what if I made a talk show concerning Autism Awareness Month, where I offered ideas that I would offer as a Beacon After School educator to parents of kids on the autism spectrum in order to help them reinforce concepts taught at school and concepts maybe the parent was trying to teach at home before they met me as it was. So at first I thought about making a movie, but then I realized, you know what, I need something for every Friday. I need something for every week of Autism Awareness Month, and not just that one submission. And traditionally, I would have done just the one submission anyway. I would have done the recap on where I was at as far as my achievements went, but newsflash, even I can comprehend that these are extraordinary times, and so using my ordinary autism awareness acknowledgement methods would not have worked. So I needed a new platform, and I knew that TV shows have had an impact on people's lives and have had changes made to people's lives, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worst, sometimes for no benefit or detriment at all. And that's where Autism Fridays with Christopher Cleveland came in. And with that, I'd like to conclude the pilot episode of Autism Fridays with Christopher Cleveland. Be sure to be back Friday next week for another round, and I'll hope to see you then. See ya.
Starring, edited, directed, produced, and written by Christopher Cleveland. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.